She thought the world had already taken everything from her until a scarred dog emerged from the fog and stood between her grandson and a gun. In the quiet town of Ember Hollow, where fear used to sleep behind closed doors, a silent oath was made that night, one forged not with words, but with loyalty, wounds, and the courage to love again. What happened next changed a whole town, and it started with a boy, a grandmother, and a dog no one wanted. In the early days of October, Ember Hollow glowed with a muted kind of beauty, the kind that crept into bones and stayed there. The small town tucked into the lower ridges of the Ozarks carried the scent of falling leaves and chimney smoke. Crimson and amber swirled through the narrow roads like fire set loose from the trees themselves. Autumn had arrived not in a rush, but with a hush, as if the world were holding its breath. On the farthest end of Hollypine Road, past the general store and the one-room post office, stood a weather-worn house wrapped in cedar shingles and climbing ivy. The home belonged to Eunice Whitlock, a 67-year-old retired field nurse with a spine as straight as the oak trees behind her porch. Her hair was cropped close silver and practical, and her wardrobe rarely strayed beyond sturdy jeans and layered flannel. Life had made her frugal, precise, and unflinchingly protective, especially since the day her daughter and son-in-law were lost in a highway crash 3 years prior, leaving behind her only grandson, Calder. Whitlock 13 was a boy shaped by quiet. Neither outgoing nor shy, he carried a thoughtful presence often lost in books or tinkering with found objects from the woods. His wiry frame and copper-toned hair gave him a fox-like energy, watchful, lean, and agile. But beneath his stillness was a core of steel that had begun hardening since that terrible summer. The day it all began was one of those dusky afternoons where time seemed to slow. Eunice was inside preparing a pot of venison stew when she heard a strange creak near the back porch. The wind wasn't strong enough to make the floorboards sing like that, and something instinctive in her stirred. She wiped her hands on her apron and quietly reached into the drawer for the small revolver she hadn't used in years, just in case. Outside, Calder was gathering kindling from the pile near the woodshed. He'd noticed movement earlier, shadows that didn't quite move like animals but had shrugged it off. Ember Hollow was safe, or at least it had been. He bent to scoop another handful of dry sticks when the voice hit him low, gravelly and wrong. "Easy, kid. We just want to look around." Calder froze, straightening slowly to see 2 men step from behind the tree line. Neither wore masks, and that made it worse. One was broad, heavy-set with patchy stubble and a ball cap pulled low over dark eyes. The other was leaner, dressed in an oil-stained work jacket and boots that looked too new. They didn't carry weapons openly, but Calder could see the shape of a crowbar, half tucked behind the tall one's back. The larger man, who introduced himself only as Reese, grinned, with a mouth missing 2 teeth. "We heard this place had some good gear lying around. Just paying a visit." Calder backed toward the house instinctively, heart hammering. But he knew the door would take too long to bolt. Eunice was likely in the kitchen, and by the time he could call out, the men would be on him. Then something impossible happened. From the tree line to their right, a blur of motion shot forward, low, fast, and growling with a thunderous sound that stopped everyone cold. A large dog, unmistakably a German shepherd, lunged out of the fading light and planted itself between Calder and the intruders. He was magnificent, thick-coated black, fading into gray at the flanks with a hint of tan near the underbelly. His body rippled with power. Even though he carried a slight limp on his front left paw, he was lean but not emaciated, his eyes a strange golden brown. Intelligent, burning, focused. Reese swore and took a step back, instinctively raising his hands. "The hell is that?" The dog growled again, a deep, guttural sound that didn't threaten, it warned. The smaller man reached for his crowbar, but before he could raise it, Eunice's voice rang out like a rifle shot. "You take one more step and I put a bullet in your damn foot." She stood on the porch, revolver in a hand expression carved from granite. The wind caught the hem of her flannel shirt and lifted the gray in her hair, making her look taller than she was. Reese looked at her, then the dog, then the boy, and decided it wasn't worth it. With a sneer and a mumble, the two men backed off into the woods. Calder didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until they were gone. The dog, still tense, watched the tree line for another full minute before turning to face the boy. He made no move, simply stood still, ears twitching. Then, with the slow deliberation of something that had learned not to trust too easily, the dog lay down. Eunice approached warily. "He yours?" she asked, lowering her weapon. Calder shook his head. Never seen him before. They waited to see if the dog would leave, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed there on the grass, alert, but calm, not even panting hard from the chase. As the wind picked up and rustled the dry leaves in the gutters, Calder knelt. "Gideon," he said suddenly, almost involuntarily. Eunice raised an eyebrow. "That what you're naming him? He looks like someone who protects." Calder replied softly, like he was meant to. For the rest of the evening, the dog didn't move far. He settled near the porch steps, watching. When Eunice brought out a bowl of leftover chicken and a clean towel, he waited until she backed away before touching them. Calder watched him eat slowly, deliberately, as if unused to regular meals. That night, the boy stared at the ceiling of his room and whispered to the darkness, "You saved us, didn't you?" Somewhere outside, a low, contented huff drifted through the cool air. By morning, the news had already started to spread. In towns like Ember Hollow, stories traveled faster than wind through wheat. The sheriff's deputy stopped by. Neighbors came just to check in, and word of a strange scarred dog defending a boy, and his grandmother took root in whispers and wide eyes. Some were skeptical, others intrigued, but all agreed on one thing. Nothing like this had happened in Ember Hollow in a long, long time. The next morning, Ember Hollow lay beneath a misty veil, soft gray light filtering through the heavy sky. Fog drifted low along the tree line behind the Whitlock house, swallowing the tops of the pines like slow smoke. The ground was damp from an overnight drizzle, and the air carried the damp, earthy scent of wet leaves. It was the kind of weather that made you think in whispers and walk in boots. Eunice Whitlock stood on the back porch with a thermos of black coffee in one hand and her other hand tucked inside the pocket of her fleece jacket. Her eyes, still sharp, despite age and years of fatigue, were fixed on the figure resting near the edge of the yard, Gideon, the dog who had emerged from the woods the night before to save her grandson. He lay in a sphinx-like position beneath the sugar maple eyes, half-lidded but alert head, occasionally turning at the rustle of a bird or squirrel. The morning light caught on the matte black and silver of his coat, and for a moment he looked more statue than creature carved out of dusk and duty. Eunice had risen early, unable to sleep. Her mind ran in restless circles, not out of fear for her safety, but from something deeper, older, a memory long buried beneath bandages and morphine smells. She had once treated military dogs during her brief time stationed overseas in the 80s. Some had been just as big as Gideon, just as silent, just as broken, and one had bitten her. Her right hand, though steady now, bore a faint scar across the ridge of the thumb. She had been patching up a dog named Brutus when he snapped out of fear, not aggression, and clamped down on her hand. The moment had never quite left her, a phantom that returned any time she saw those familiar eyes, intelligent, calculating, too human for comfort. And yet here she was watching a boy she loved sit beside such a creature, like it was nothing more dangerous than a barn cat. Calder had brought Gideon a bowl of leftover chicken and placed it near the roots of the maple. The boy now sat cross-legged nearby, quietly, reading aloud from an old paperback he'd found in the attic. Gideon listened, or at least pretended to. Eunice stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching the damp grass. As she approached the dog, Gideon lifted his head. She crouched slowly, careful not to move too quickly. Her hand reached out, not to touch, just to gesture, and that's when she saw it. His left front leg closer to the joint bore a thin line of raised scar tissue. The fur grew thinner in that patch, slightly discolored. The dog shifted his weight subtly when he stood, and that's when she confirmed it. A limp, not severe but deliberate. He had been injured. Not recently, not enough to bleed, but the kind of damage that never fully healed. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she muttered under her breath. Gideon made no sound, just blinked, almost as if acknowledging her words. Back on the porch, Calder had stopped reading. "Did he let you get close?" he asked. "I didn't try." Eunice answered, standing. "But I saw the leg. He's been hurt before. Should we take him to the vet?" "Not yet," she replied. "Let's not spook him. He's already chosen to stay." That's more than most would. Despite the throb of old memories, Eunice said nothing about her own scar. She turned back toward the house, her face tight. Her thoughts noisier than she'd admit. Maybe this was her chance to make peace with what happened all those years ago. Maybe the boy needed this dog more than she feared him. Elsewhere in Ember Hollow, inside the town's modest administrative office, painted in fading eggshell blue, Mayor Rufus Ambrose sat with his elbows pressed into a cluttered desk. A man in his late 50s with a belly that arrived in the room before he did, Ambrose wore a forest green cardigan over a checkered shirt that was missing its top button. His hair was a valiant comb-over, stubborn against the thinning tide of age. He grumbled to himself as he flicked through a small stack of complaint forms. The top sheet was from a woman who lived on Edge Pine Lane. "Noises outside my window," it read, "scratching sounds like claws on metal." The next one mentioned barking long and low, not like a normal dog. One even claimed to have seen a dark figure with yellow eyes moving between the trees at midnight. Ambrose sighed and reached for his coffee, which had gone cold. He didn't believe in ghost stories or werewolves. He believed in voter complaints. And lately, they were multiplying. The areas near the woods were seeing more disturbances than usual. Trash bins overturned, mailboxes dented. One poor man claimed his entire stack of firewood had been dragged 20 feet without explanation. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Lord, help me, it's raccoons again," he muttered. But even as he tried to write it off, there was something about the reports that unsettled him. The pattern, the consistency. Whatever was moving through the outskirts of town wasn't wild in the usual sense. It was smart, calculated. He made a note to speak with Sheriff Boone the next morning. Back at the Whitlock residence, Eunice stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes while Calder leaned against the doorway, watching Gideon through the fogged-up glass. He didn't bark once the boy said almost to himself, "What's that last night?" When those men showed up, he didn't bark, just ran at them like he knew. Eunice wiped her hands on a towel. Some dogs don't bark. They act. That's what makes them dangerous and what makes them loyal. Calder nodded, then hesitated. "Can I keep feeding him?" "Just out back." Eunice paused, then nodded. "So long as he stays there, don't try to chain him. Let him decide." As the sun dipped behind the pines and the evening chill settled in again, Gideon curled into his place under the tree. He watched the house not with longing, but with vigilance, and inside Eunice lit a single lamp, casting a golden glow that spilled out into the growing dusk. No one knew yet what Gideon had been. But all three, the woman, the boy, and the dog, sensed that the quiet wouldn't last. The morning came with a hush and a sky the color of pewter. The fog from the night before still clung low over Ember Hollow, wrapping around chimney tops and fence posts like gauze. From his window, Calder watched the yard blur into dreamlike shapes. Grasses bowed under dew. The maple leaves scattered like burnt gold, and in the middle of it all, Gideon curled beneath the tree head, resting over his front paws, silent as ever. It had been 3 days since Gideon first appeared, and Eunice, while still reserved, had stopped giving Calder the sideways glances whenever he brought food outside. She even muttered a dry, "Don't forget the bowl," that morning before he stepped onto the porch. That was progress. Calder figured he placed the dish on the ground gently and noticed something he hadn't before. Around Gideon's neck beneath the thick fur was the faint edge of an old collar. Most of it was obscured, but a frayed strip of material clung beneath the layers of coat. Curious, Calder sat down beside him. Gideon didn't stir. Gently, Calder reached out and parted the fur. That's when he saw it. A rusted metal tag, barely the size of a coin, was half torn from its loop, dangling by a single wire thread. The leather collar it was attached to had long since worn through, but the tag had survived scratched and corroded, yet unmistakably engraved. He rubbed away the dirt with his sleeve. Etched into the metal were faint but legible characters: TXK9, 0 Huartzuoe 67. Calder's breath caught. "You were trained," he whispered. "K9. He looked up. Gideon's amber eyes were open, watching him, not alarmed, but not indifferent either. It was as though he understood what the boy had just discovered and chose to say nothing. That afternoon, Calder slipped into the den while Eunice napped and booted up her old desktop computer. The internet in their house was sluggish on the best days, but after several minutes of searching combinations of TXK9 code tag and dog unit 042A67, he found something that made his stomach tighten. An archived article from a small news site in Louisiana controversial military dog training facility, shuttered after abuse allegations. The article, dated 2 years prior, detailed the sudden closure of a privately run training compound named Longthorn Tactical Canine Unit, located just across the state line. The report claimed multiple former handlers had stepped forward, citing poor treatment, inhumane training methods, and instances of dogs going missing under suspicious circumstances. Images accompanying the article showed grim cages, high fences, and lean German shepherds with muzzles and blank expressions. The compound had been sued by animal rights activists and quietly dissolved months later. There was no mention of specific dogs, but Calder's mind had already filled in the blanks. Meanwhile, across town, Sheriff Dahlia Boone sat in her office, poring over the week's report logs. The woman moved with the grace of someone who had learned to read chaos like sheet music. In her early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered with tightly braided hair pulled back into a bun, Dahlia had a voice like gravel dipped in honey. No one crossed her more than once. Her deputy, Mason O'Reilly, knocked twice before stepping in. A stocky man in his late 20s, Mason wore his uniform like armor. Always spotless, always tucked. "You'll want to see this," he said. Setting a manila folder on her desk, Boone opened it and began reading. Several calls had come in from households bordering the Pine Belt, all similar shadows in the trees, barking with no visible dog, and in one case a mailman reporting a large animal following his truck down 3 blocks before vanishing near the cemetery woods. Then came Mason's note. Pattern matches. Prior. Stray dog sightings. Description matches partial. Canine breed, black and tan. Scarred foreleg trained behavior. Silent, trailing, defensive posture. Dahlia narrowed her eyes. That's the 3rd one this month with those traits. 4th, if you count the Whitlock incident. Mason added. Dahlia tapped her pen against the desk. Run the serial tags again. Focus on disbanded or dissolved K9 programs in bordering states. There was that training scandal a while back. What was it called? Longthorn Mason said. Texas Registry. Closed after a whistleblower lawsuit. Check for dogs that were never reassigned. I want a list. Back on Holly Pine Road. Calder printed the article and clipped it into his notebook. He didn't tell Eunice yet. She'd only just started accepting Gideon's presence, and he didn't want to ruin the fragile trust they'd built. Instead, he returned to the backyard with the rusted tag in his pocket. Gideon lifted his head as Calder approached. This time, Calder didn't speak. He simply sat beside him and placed the tag on the grass between them. Gideon stared at it for a long while before closing his eyes again as if confirming something unspoken. That evening after dinner, Eunice noticed the notebook Calder had left on the table. Flipping it open absent-mindedly, she found the article, its headline circled with a copy of the tag number written below, in Calder's careful print. Her mouth went dry. The photograph in the article of one particular shepherd with a bandaged leg, and those same burning eyes felt like a slap of recognition. Outside, the porch light flicked on automatically. In the halo of its glow, Gideon sat, watch near the steps, his head turned toward the woods, listening. The afternoon sun had barely pierced the thick canopy of clouds hanging over Ember Hollow when a dusty pickup truck rolled slowly down Holly Pine Road. It came to a stop just beyond the mailbox, leaning crookedly in front of the Whitlock home, its engine idling with a faint metallic rattle. The vehicle was old, a faded red Ford with scratches running down one side like claw marks, the sort of truck that looked like it had more stories than its owner could tell in one sitting. Calder heard it first from the living room, where he had been sitting cross-legged on the rug, poring once again over his notebook. At the sound of the engine, Gideon rose from his usual place by the sliding door, posture stiff and tail still, his ears pointed forward, alert, his amber eyes narrowing toward the yard. Eunice glanced up from her armchair, expecting someone. No, Calder said, already heading toward the window. The man who stepped out of the truck was tall, mid-40s, wiry, but strong in that ranch hand sort of way. He wore a canvas jacket faded at the shoulders, mud-stained jeans and a baseball cap pulled low over a weathered face. His jaw was angular, lined with days-old stubble, and his boots made solid, deliberate thuds as he walked toward the porch. When he knocked, it wasn't timid, it was the knock of someone who didn't believe in asking. Twice, Eunice opened the door halfway. "Yes, ma'am," the man said, tipping his cap slightly. "Sorry to trouble you. Name's Silas Drexler. I'm from Dalton Creek, about 2 counties over." His voice had the smooth grit of someone who spent more time talking to animals than people. "What brings you here, Mr. Drexler?" Eunice asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm looking for my dog," he said simply. "His name's Jack's German Shepherd. Went missing 3 weeks ago, last seen near the state border." He pulled a folded photo from his jacket pocket and held it up. Eunice took it and studied the image. The dog in the picture was large, proud, with intense golden eyes and a black and tan coat. Its left foreleg bore a faint scar, just like I heard from a friend that someone round this part found a shepherd wandering near the woods. Silas continued. "Thought I'd come check for myself." Eunice nodded once. "Wait here." She closed the door and turned to Calder, who stood clutching the curtain. "You stay inside, but I'll take him out. Outside." Gideon stood rigid near the porch steps. He hadn't moved since the truck arrived, but something had shifted in him. The calm, almost serene creature Calder had come to trust was gone, replaced with a version of Gideon Calder had never seen. His body was taut, his ears flat, and when Eunice approached with a clipped leash in hand, Gideon's lip curled ever so slightly. "It's all right," she said gently, looping the leash over his head. "Just a check." She led him slowly toward the porch. The moment Silas's eyes met the dog's, Gideon stopped in his tracks. His growl started low, a deep rumbling warning that made the hairs on Eunice's neck rise. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't fear. It was something ancient and territorial. "Easy now," Silas said, but his voice had changed. The edges had sharpened just slightly. "I know that sound. That's Jax's war growl." Eunice frowned. "He's never acted like this, not once." "He remembers," Silas said. "He's been through things. He's a trained K-9, part of a contract unit. Got out during a storm, that scar on his leg. My doing. Had surgery after a fence, tore him up on patrol." Calder, ignoring Eunice's instruction, stepped outside. "He saved me," the boy said, planting himself between Silas and the dog. "That night when those men tried to break in, he didn't bark, didn't wait, just acted. That dog's a hero." Gideon, still tense, stepped to Calder's side, eyes never leaving Silas. His tail didn't wag. His breathing remained slow, controlled. "I'm sure he did," Silas said, keeping his hands in plain view. "He was trained for that, but he's mine, kid." Eunice's gaze hardened. "You say he's trained, but you didn't report him missing to any shelters. There were no flyers, no microchip records linked to your name. What kind of owner lets a dog like this vanish without a trace?" Silas hesitated. "The facility I worked for got shut down. Things got complicated. I had to leave town fast. And the dog she pressed, I was coming back for him," he said. "Didn't expect him to make it this far." Calder clenched his fists. "He doesn't want to go with you." Gideon let out another growl, louder this time. A warning, not from fear, but memory. "Maybe he's confused," Silas offered. "Trauma does that." "Or maybe," Eunice said slowly, "he remembers exactly who you are." Silas's mouth drew into a hard line. He looked at the dog once more, then turned. "I'll be back," he muttered, walking briskly to his truck, with papers. The tires kicked up gravel as he pulled away. After he left, Gideon exhaled and sat. His body still held tension, but his eyes softened the moment Calder placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's not Jax," Calder said. "He's Gideon." Eunice looked from the boy to the dog and nodded. "We're not giving him up. Not like that." As the sun dipped low behind the pines, Calder and Gideon remained on the porch steps. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and something else like ash and rusted metal. Gideon's ears twitched. He wasn't just protecting Calder anymore. He was choosing him. The days in Ember Hollow had grown crisp, the sky beginning to turn the pale silver of mid-autumn. Leaves drifted in quiet spirals down the streets, layering the yards and sidewalks in hues of rust and gold. At the Whitlock house, the maple tree behind the porch now stood almost bare, its limbs skeletal against the pale horizon. But beneath those branches, Gideon remained still, as stone and twice as watchful. Ever since Silas Drexler's visit, the shepherd had not slept deeply. He listened to the night, always tense, always alert. Sheriff Dahlia Boone stood in her dimly lit office, flipping through a report she had requested from a contact at the State Bureau. A shaft of late-morning light cut through the blinds, striping the desk in gold and shadow. She wore her usual tan patrol shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the faint outline of an old scar visible across her forearm, a remnant from her early days in a city department before Ember Hollow. Boone was not one for drama, but the name Silas Drexler had sparked something cold and familiar in her memory. Mason O'Reilly, her deputy, leaned against the doorframe, sipping lukewarm coffee. Anything. Boone's eyes scanned the final page and narrowed. He's not just some guy who lost a dog. Silas Drexler ran a private security outfit in Louisiana. Official name was Sentinel K-9 Services. On the books, it was legit, offering trained protection dogs to wealthy clients and private firms. But in 2021, a whistleblower accused him of animal cruelty, said they forced dogs through violent scenarios, kept them in cages, fed them stimulant pills to enhance aggression. State closed it down. Mason's brow furrowed. Any charges, nothing stuck. Boone said, setting the papers down. The facility went dark before authorities got there. Dogs vanished. Records, too. Drexler went off-grid for a year. Now he's showing up in my town asking for a dog that clearly doesn't want him. Mason shook his head. You want me to keep eyes on him? No, Boone replied, already rising. I want us to find where he's staying. Meanwhile, on the other side of Ember Hollow, Calder and his best friend Emmett Cross crouched behind a row of overgrown hedges 2 blocks from the Whitlock house. Emmett, 13, and wiry with unruly curls and a chipped tooth from a biking accident, was the kind of kid who believed walkie-talkies were still peak technology. He wore a camo hoodie far too big for him and carried a GoPro strapped to his forehead like a miner's lamp. His parents, laid-back artists who ran a frame shop, had long since given up trying to keep him clean or quiet. I told you, Emmett whispered excitedly. That's his truck. The red Ford was parked down the block, partially hidden behind a line of trash bins. They had spotted it earlier that morning while walking Emmett's dog, a shaggy mutt named Biscuit. But instead of continuing home, they had circled back with a camera and a pack of pretzels. Calder focused the lens of his borrowed camcorder on the street. The truck sat idle. After 10 minutes, a shadow moved in the driver's seat. Silas Drexler stepped out, scanned the street, then slunk behind a thicket of pine trees toward the back trail that led to the Whitlock's property line. Emmett nudged Calder. He's sneaking around again. Told you he wasn't done. Calder's heart pounded, but he kept filming. We need to show this to Sheriff Boone. In that moment, they weren't just 2 boys hiding behind bushes. They were defenders of something fragile and fierce. Something with 4 legs and a haunted look in his eyes. Gideon had chosen Calder, and Calder was choosing him back. Back at the house, Eunice had decided to dig through the old mailbox mounted beside the shed, a rusted relic from when the house had 2 mail routes. It hadn't been opened in years, but something about the encounter with Silas left her restless. She wanted proof. Something real. The mailbox creaked when she forced it open. Inside, beneath a nest of leaves and spider silk, she found a sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of weathered flyers. It had no stamp, no return address. Her name was scrawled across it in slanted, heavy handwriting. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a bundle of receipts. The paper read, Delivery. Completed, amount received. Further instructions await SD. The receipts were handwritten. Records, cash transfers dated in sequences each, a few $100s spread over 6 months. Names were scratched out, replaced with vague labels, like protection fee or boarding. Eunice stared at the papers, her fingers curling around the envelope. She didn't know what angered her more, that someone had used her house as a mailbox, or that Silas thought this would go unnoticed. This wasn't about a lost dog. This was a business. And somewhere in that business, Gideon had been a commodity. Later that evening, Calder and Emmett sat in Calder's room, reviewing the grainy footage. The video clearly showed Silas leaving his truck and circling toward the property. You think the sheriff's gonna believe us? Emmett asked. She will. Calder said, his voice steady. She has to. They copied the file onto a USB stick and agreed to bike it to the station the next morning. As they talked, Gideon lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head to glance at the door. He wasn't just listening for noise, he was waiting for something familiar to return. Maybe it was Silas, or maybe it was the version of himself he had left behind. The wind began hours before the rain did long, heavy breaths, weaving through the pine woods, shaking window panes and whistling through the cracks beneath doors. By twilight, Ember Hollow had been wrapped in a dull hush, the air thick and tense as if the town itself was bracing for something beyond the approaching storm. Calder stood at the porch with Gideon pressed against his side. The boy was barefoot. Arms crossed his heart, skittering with unease, The shepherd's body was taut, but grounded eyes focused on the road like a soldier waiting for an order. Eunice had drawn every curtain in the house and bolted both doors. Though neither she nor Calder had said it aloud, they were waiting. And then just after nightfall, headlights emerged from the trees. A black SUV pulled up, followed by a second vehicle low to the ground, with no plates and tinted windows that reflected only the stormlight. From the first stepped Silas Drexler, his posture stiff beneath a long oilskin coat, the brim of his hat low enough to shadow most of his face. Two men stepped out from the second car. Neither spoke. Both wore nondescript gray clothing and held papers tight against the wind that had begun to howl. Eunice appeared in the doorway behind Calder, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping an old cane she rarely used. She did not speak, only met Silas's gaze with the kind of steel born of long life and hard-earned instinct. "We're here to claim what's ours," Silas called out, holding up a folded document. Signed affidavit, notarized custody. "This dog was stolen." Calder stepped forward. "He saved me." "You don't understand what he is," Silas said. "You're a child." "No," Calder said firmly. "I'm his person." Before Silas could take a step closer, Gideon moved between them. No growl, no bark. Just the full weight of his body placed like a drawn line in the sand. His eyes locked on Silas's, and for a long moment neither moved. The two men beside Silas glanced at each other nervously. Thunder cracked above, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Rain began in sheets dense, sideways, and furious. Trees bent like they were bowing to something unseen. From behind the line of trees movement stirred first a single figure, then two. Then a dozen flashlights bobbed through the dark neighbors, men and women from the nearby homes, wearing parkas and boots, their faces grim, determined. Among them was Miss Tilda Hartley, a retired schoolteacher with a sharp tongue and snow-white hair, in a bun that had never once come undone. She stood beside her husband, Reverend Amos Hartley, tall, thin, and cane-bound, but with a spine straighter than any oak. "This is Whitlock land," Reverend Hartley called out, "and unless you've got a sheriff's badge, you're trespassing." Silas turned slowly, scanning the growing crowd. His lips twitched. "You don't understand what you're protecting. That dog is a product of violence. You think he's yours now. You think loyalty makes him safe." Eunice spoke then, her voice clear despite the storm. "What makes him dangerous isn't what you did to him. It's what he survived in spite of you." From behind the crowd came the sharp screech of tires. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees. Sheriff Boone's cruiser skidded into the muddy road, followed closely by two more deputies. Boone stepped out without hesitation, rain slicking her shoulders. Her badge caught a gleam of lightning. "Mr. Drexler," she said, "you're under investigation for animal cruelty, fraudulent documentation, and for making threats against minors. You will place the papers on the hood of your car and step away slowly." Silas didn't move. One of his men tensed beside him, but Gideon snarled a deep rising sound like something pulled from the base of the earth. In the chaos of thunder and rain, the sound was primal. Boone unholstered her sidearm. "Don't test my patience." With a slow sigh, Silas stepped back. One of the men dropped the folder on the hood while the other raised both hands. Boone's deputies advanced swiftly, securing all three with zip ties. As Silas was led toward the cruiser, he turned to look back. His eyes not on Calder, not on Eunice, but on Gideon. There was something hollow in that look, like a man realizing too late that the leash he once held now lay buried in the mud behind him. "Traitor," he muttered. Gideon didn't react. He only turned to Calder, pressing his damp head into the boy's chest, as if to say, "I chose you, not him." Eunice, soaked to the bone, wiped her face and looked toward the sheriff. "It's over." Boone nodded. "For now." but I want to talk to you tomorrow about what else Silas left behind." One by one, the neighbors drifted away through the storm, murmuring quiet words of comfort. Reverend Hartley tipped his hat to Calder. "The Lord sent us angels in strange armor, son." That night the storm beat down for hours. Inside the house, Calder sat beside Gideon, wrapped in a blanket, both of them listening to the wind with quiet reverence. The house didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a promise. Morning came soft and gold, the kind that drapes Ember Hollow in a hush after a storm. The sky stretched wide and clear, clouds pulled back like curtains after a long and troubled act. Patches of sun spilled through the maple trees, their branches arching like stained glass ceilings above the Whitlock property. The town itself seemed quieter, as if the wind had carried away the last of its fear. Calder sat on the back porch sketchpad in his lap. Gideon curled beside him like a shadow with fur. The German shepherd, now fully healed, had regained a graceful strength, his stride, even his eyes, calmer. Yet beneath that calmness there remained a steady alertness, a sense that the war might not be over, only paused. He was 5 years old, the vet said, but carried himself like a soldier. 2 lives older than that, Eunice stood nearby, leaning against the porch post with a mug of black coffee. The morning light softened the fine lines around her face, and the cane she had once gripped in anxious tension now rested idly against the railing. Her cardigan was thick wool, hand-knit decades ago, with a blue jay stitched near the heart. She watched her grandson draw with a quiet pride that tasted faintly of awe. "You said you had an idea," she finally said. Calder nodded without looking up. "A place for dogs like Gideon. A kennel." "No," he said, flipping the page, "a home, a center, where dogs like him hurt, scared, abandoned, get another chance. A place where they're not trained to fight or guard, just to heal." Eunice lowered her cup. "You want to start a rescue. I want to build one. Gideon's Haven." It took less than a week for word to spread. Sheriff Boone, who had begun to quietly coordinate with state animal control regarding Silas's case, was the first to endorse the idea. "There'll be dogs displaced from his facilities," she explained during one of her visits, setting a stack of paperwork on Eunice's kitchen table. "Some might be too old or too traumatized to adopt out. But if there's a place with structure and compassion somewhere, they can recover. That could change lives." Human and otherwise, the town rallied. It was Emmett Cross, mischievous, gap-toothed, and now unofficial assistant director, who began scouring Craigslist for fencing materials and old doghouses. He knocked on every door within biking distance, pulling his little wagon full of donated leashes and worn tennis balls. Calder's classmates designed flyers. Mrs. Hartley donated gardening tools and arranged a bake sale with the church choir. Even the reclusive Mr. Dalrymple, who hadn't spoken to anyone in a decade except his cat, delivered a roll of tarp and a solemn nod. The land behind the Whitlock house stretched half an acre into the woods, shaded, bordered by old stone walls and bramble, and perfect for what Calder envisioned. They began clearing it that weekend. Trees were left standing, of course. The entire design was built around them. Gideon didn't like fences unless he could see through them. Calder insisted it be the same for the others. By month's end, the first kennel was raised more a cabin than a cage made of repurposed barnwood with a sunroof of plexiglass. They built it under the oldest maple on the property, its amber leaves fluttering down like 1,000 blessings. The first dog to arrive was Luna, a small one-eyed border collie mixed with trust issues and a bark that could shake floorboards. She had been found tied behind a shed in the next county, emaciated and shaking. But when Gideon approached her head, low, tail steady, she didn't growl. She whimpered and pressed her nose into his chest. She didn't bark again that day. Gideon's role, as it turned out, went far beyond guard, dog, or symbol. He became the silent ambassador of the haven, walking beside the newly arrived, showing them where the water bowls were, when to lie down, when to trust. He didn't correct them with teeth or sound just presence. He was proof that scars could heal without vanishing. That fear didn't have to be permanent. Eunice surprised everyone by becoming the most attentive caretaker. She learned to bathe the dogs, trim their nails, and bake homemade biscuits. The fear that had once tightened her chest at the sight of a large dog now only made her work harder. It was Calder who noticed the shift first. "You're not afraid anymore," he said one morning as she fed a young Doberman named Tucker. "I am," she said. "But that doesn't mean I don't show up." By December, Gideon's Haven had 8 residents and a waiting list. Boone helped file nonprofit paperwork, and a local news crew came to feature their story. Calder was uncomfortable on camera, but Gideon wasn't. He sat perfectly still beside his boy ears, up eyes forward, as if he understood this was the beginning of something bigger than both of them. The morning light spilled gently across Windmere Hill, casting long gold fingers through the waking trees. Below, Ember Hollow stirred to life. School buses rattling down maple-lined roads, the bakery's chimney puffing little clouds of cinnamon warmth, and dogs barking in chorus from behind white picket fences and wood-paneled barns. It was a year to the day since the storm, since Gideon stood between Calder and a man from his past and changed the course of more lives than anyone could count. Gideon's Haven had grown not just in size, but in purpose. The original kennels under the maple canopy now stretched into a shaded trail system with resting circles, therapy huts, and wide-open runs for dogs to roam. A handcrafted wooden sign hung at the entrance, "Gideon's Haven, where hope has a tail." Calder Whitlock, now 13, had grown an inch and a half, lost his last baby tooth, and gained a calmness in his voice that surprised even the adults around him. He stood barefoot in the dew-covered grass clipboard, in hand a whistle hanging from a paracord lanyard around his neck. His hair had grown shaggy over the summer, and there were calluses on his palms from fence repairs and leash drills. But his eyes still held the same steady blue quiet and storm-tested. A group of children gathered in a circle before him, some cross-legged, others bouncing on their sneakers. They ranged from 6 to 11 kids from the elementary school homeschoolers, and a few who'd been referred by the local counselor for anxiety or speech delay. They were here for Calder's class, listening without words. "I want you all to close your eyes." Calder said, his voice soft but clear. "Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold it. Let it out. Do it again." A few kids giggled. One boy peeked. "That means you too." "Zach." Calder smiled. "Even superheroes have to breathe." The children settled, and as they did, Gideon entered the circle. Now 6 years old, his once scarred leg fully healed, the German shepherd moved with fluid strength. His black and tan coat shone in the morning light, and his ears twitched at every sound. He passed each child slowly, his steps deliberate as if reading the rhythm of their breaths. When he reached Lucy Farrow, a quiet girl with pigtails and thick pink glasses, he sat beside her and laid his head in her lap. Lucy didn't speak often, not since her parents' divorce, but she smiled now, her fingers tangling in Gideon's fur. "That's his way of saying you're safe," Calder whispered behind them. Eunice stood beneath the shade of a birch, wrapped in her favorite shawl. Her eyes, once wary around animals, now glistened with pride. She had taken to managing the donation ledger and weekly food inventory. Gideon followed her every morning as she made her rounds, as if still needing to know where she was, even if not protecting her. Further down the path, Boone, now promoted to county liaison for animal welfare, oversaw an incoming crate delivery. She wore jeans, a navy work jacket, and her badge on a nylon loop. Her hair was pulled into a practical bun, and she had taken to carrying milk bones in her pocket just in case. Every dog trusted Boone, and Boone trusted Gideon. Emmett Cross, slightly taller, but just as wild-eyed as ever, skated in on a modified scooter made from repurposed kennel wheels. He had taken over media for the Haven filming adoption videos and managing their TikTok with the help of his mom. He still called Calder Captain, and had crafted a commemorative plaque for Gideon out of driftwood and brass keys. At noon, the children broke for juice and fruit slices. Calder stayed behind with Gideon beneath the old maple that had shaded them since the beginning. "You're still watching," Calder said, rubbing behind his ears. Even now, Gideon blinked slowly, then rested his chin on the boy's knee. His eyes were gentler these days, but they still carried the echo of memory of woods and wire of commands barked in cruel tones of silence heavier than chains. But here, with wind in his fur and children laughing nearby, he seemed to carry that past like a scar that had become part of the story, not the ending. The town itself had changed too. Ember Hollow had added a new town hall mural painted by local artist Janae Locke, a woman in her 50s with short silver curls and deep-set hazel eyes. The mural featured Gideon, eyes forward, flanked by Calder and Eunice under a sky full of falling leaves. At the mural's base, a single line: "Sometimes the bravest among us have 4 legs." The town now hosted Haven Days. Each September, a festival with dog costume contests, healing workshops, and trail walks, led by Boone local farmers, donated grain-free biscuits, and the town's old library building had been repurposed into the Learning Lab, where children learned animal behavior, empathy, and rescue ethics. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Windmere Hill, Calder sat beside Gideon on the hilltop bench, the same spot where it all began. Lights from town flickered below, like tiny stars on earth. Wind stirred the leaves above them. "You saved me," Calder said softly, "and I just tried to be worthy of that." Gideon said nothing, but he leaned in closer, resting his entire weight against Calder's side. Sometimes God sends miracles not with thunder or light from the sky, but on 4 quiet paws through a child's steady hand, and in the healing of a heart. Once hardened by fear, Gideon's journey is more than just the story of a dog. It is a reminder that no soul is too broken to be redeemed, and no beginning too lost to lead to hope. In a world that often speaks too loudly, Gideon taught a town how to listen. In a time when fear divides, he brought strangers together, and in a place forgotten by many, he helped build a home where second chances bloom like sunlight after storm. Let this be a reminder that when you open your heart to love, even the smallest act of kindness can grow into a haven for many. You never know when God will use your courage to light the way for someone else. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to join our growing community of healing and compassion. And if you believe like we do that God's hand can work through even the gentlest of creatures, comment, Amen, and may the Lord bless you with peace, purpose, and people who love you like family.